Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation titled Connecting the Pieces of Job Satisfaction and Well-Being Using Job Crafting as a Means to Find a Meaning. My name is Kendrick with Liberty University School of Behavioral Science, and I want to thank you for joining me on what I believe to be a very intriguing concept. So let's get started. The term job crafting is a fairly new theoretical model that was coined by Amy Wojciechowski and Jane Dutton in 2001. So, like I said, it's a fairly new concept that is really just beginning to gain traction and be expanded upon. And as it's kind of becoming a little bit more well known and researched, it became framed within the jobs demand resources model, which is a work stress model, which mainly just suggests that stress comes from when there's an imbalance between what someone is supposed to accomplish, the demands, and what they have to accomplish it with, the resources, and the individuals themselves. So, with job crafting, the authors defined it as the physical and cognitive changes that individuals make in the task or relational boundaries of their work. So, what does this mean? Well, saying if you change the way you think about your work or perceive your work, you'll experience new meaning in your work. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How does new meaning get created from the way work is perceived? So, not necessarily a new notion, but the authors presented three different ways in which work can be perceived for individuals to find new meaning. So the first one we'll look at down at the bottom left there is task job crafting, and that's the what of job crafting. That's looking at the actions that one takes within their work to create new meaning within each action. An example would be if someone was in IT, but they really love graphic design. So they spend time outside of work designing a cool new logo for their IT department, and they present it to the director, and the director says, hey, that's really cool. Let's put that on all of our emails as the watermark. So that's an example, and I'm glad to say that's actually kind of a true story. So the second one down the middle there is relationship or relational job crafting, and that's the who aspect of job crafting. And that pertains to whom you decide to interact with at work, right? So if you're in accounting, but you want to get to understand a little better how clients are actually attracted to the products, you may decide to spend some time with the marketing team. And the third one down there is cognitive, and that's the why aspect, which has far started to become a little bit more prominent in the research area, and that's why it'll be the crux of our discussion today. And we'll talk about all three as they relate to different aspects of work and organizations and individuals, but cognitive is pretty much where we're going to be headed, and it's pretty much where we're going to spend a fair amount of time. So the cognitive aspect is basically it's giving meaning to your work as it relates to you and evaluating how one is influenced by and is connected with or to their work. So let's take a quick example of this. Take a look at an example of this. So we have Grace, the network engineer for a big pharmaceutical company, and Grace enjoys her job fine for a little while, but because she gets to make cool network diagrams and she gets to set up networks for pharmacies all over the country. But after a while, Grace just starts to think of herself as that, someone who makes diagrams and sets up networks for pharmacies, and she starts to get a little bit down. Her job satisfaction starts to take a hit, and her motivation starts to dip, and her overall well-being becomes very low. Well, fortunately for Grace, her job has offered a new job crafting seminar where they'll train you how to perceive the way you work and the tasks that you do in a new meaning. And she starts to get a new perception about that. And so um, Grace uses what she learned from the seminar to change the perception of her work. So instead of thinking that all she does is make diagrams and set up pharmacy networks, she begins to think, what I really do is I get to help pharmacies run efficiently so that people can get their medications so they can live happier, healthier lives. That's awesome. So next thing you know, because she's changed the way she perceived and the meaning she found in her work, she begins to experience an enhanced satisfaction and motivation and overall well-being. So that's a simplified, fun little example about what we'll be talking about when we refer to cognitive job crafting. So how is job crafting being studied and utilized in IO psychology today? Well, we're going to take a look at four main areas and the current research that kind of gives us an idea of where the framework stands as of late. So first we'll be talking about how job crafting can be used in human resources. And we'll talk about how the concept of job crafting is used by HR managers to recruit new talent. We'll look at how they use job crafting to retain employees. And we'll see how culture plays a role fostering employees and the mindset and how the mindset can become ubiquitous throughout the company. And then we'll talk about what companies can do to promote job crafting by encouraging concepts such as proactivity and proactive behavior. We'll take a look at the role that leadership plays in fostering job crafting by example. And we'll look at how certain training and interventions can help promote organizational growth. And next, we'll take a quick look at a couple of practical ways that job crafting has been shown to be beneficial for individuals at work. So, such as dealing with times of organizational change. And we'll also look at role and job ambiguity and how crafting can help employees deal with times of uncertainty. And then finally, we'll piece it all together and we'll discuss what does it all mean. We'll talk about finding meaning in work through job crafting and how this meaning increases job satisfaction, motivation, engagement, and overall well-being. So the first area we'll take a look at is human resources. And we'll look at some recent studies that show how human resources use job crafting when it comes to talent management and how a culture of a meaning mindset can be permeated throughout the company. So the first one that we're looking at there is recruiting. And so how does HR actually go out and find talent or bring talent in the first place? So this is a very recent study here. And in fact, it just came out just earlier this year, and it's conveniently titled, at least in part, Do Job Crafting Opportunities Help Win Talent? So a little on the nose there, but this study examined that when during times of recruiting, does signaling job crafting as an opportunity, is that an attractive aspect of the job that actually increases finding the best talent? And when I say signaling, it just means putting out traits about the opportunity or the job or the company that gives the job seeker a better idea about the role or the position or about the future, their future with the company. So they hypothesized that yes, this would be the case, that if job crafting was signaled as part of the job opportunity, it would attract more and better talent, and that this talent would be more likely to accept the job if it was offered to them. So they also theorized that personality would play a mediating role about job crafting and who would it be more attractive to, which they believed that those with more proactive personality would be more likely to be drawn to such opportunities. So using a few different companies, some companies signaled job crafting, others did not. And they also accounted for the mediating factors such as expected treatment, how proactive the organizational climate was, role stress, and so on. So they looked at both the positive and the negative mediators. And this is indeed what they found. They found that job crafting was an attractive trait to signal to potential newcomers. And furthermore, they found that not only does a proactive personality greatly strengthen the attraction to these roles, but having a proactive personality helped to buffer out a lot of the negative aspects of the job. So like role stress and expectations of treatment and so on, while it also enhanced attractions to the positive aspects. So the positive aspects were rated even higher, and the negative aspects were buffered out so much. They didn't really care about that as much. So the authors concluded that, and by recommending that since job crafting has shown to be a positive attribute of a job that attracts job seekers, those with proactive work environments should tailor their work environment towards job seekers um, that need a more open approach and that emphasizes work engagement rather than the job features themselves. So the talent's been recruited, and companies have the people they want, the people they need. The next step at that point is they need to make sure that they hold on to these people. They have to make sure that they're retaining the talent they work so hard for, because recruitment is usually a pretty lengthy process, and uh, turnover can be a very costly process to companies. So retention is very important. So the question is, how can HR use the idea of job crafting to assure that people that they work so hard to get actually stay? Well, in the study there in the middle, um, again, it's a very current study that conveniently titled, again, in part, Job Crafting and Intent to Leave. So it's basically, it's greatly dependent on the job demands resource model that we just discussed earlier. And that the authors believe that if the employees use job crafting, their self-concept, the job itself, and the context of the work would increase motivation. So because they were then seeing their work as more meaningful. And the authors were interested in measuring two types of job crafting behaviors, which were the employees increasing their structural resources and increasing their challenging demands. Two very important, pretty basic, fundamental aspects of job crafting. And if this was the case, it was predicted that when that it would increase engagement and decrease their intent to leave. So, in other words, the authors hypothesized that increased structural resources, increased challenging demands would lessen their intent to leave. And that because they were using job crafting to do so, meaningfulness and engagement would mediate their intent to leave. So we see that word meaningfulness again. So the study itself was a simple online survey measuring job crafting, work engagement, work meaningfulness, turnover intentions. So nothing really fancy there. An example, let's look at an example question from the job crafting scale, which read something like, when there's not much to do at work, I see this as an opportunity to start new projects. An example from the work and meaning inventory scale, just the work and meaning inventory would be something like, I have found a meaningful career, or the work I do serves a greater purpose. So pretty spot on with those. And what the results showed was precisely what they predicted, and that meaningfulness and engagement mediated the relationship between job crafting behaviors of increased resources and increased demands, and employees tend to leave the company. So the author suggested that when an employee has the opportunity to express themselves in their work, the self-concept theory, then they are more likely to find their work meaningful, be more engaged, and therefore wanting to stay at the job longer. So how does this happen? How does a company establish a culture that promotes job crafting and meaning in one's work that transcends the entire organization? Well, culture doesn't just happen, right? It usually starts at the top. It most often starts with the leaders that create the culture through their values and their ethics and what things they say and do. So, and we're going to discuss leadership specifically more here in just a bit. But what I'm referring to when I say leadership is the culture that permeates throughout the company because of the leadership in general. So what do I mean by that? So in the bottom study there, that was again a very recent study, just again earlier this year. The authors they examined whether an organization's culture of positive error orientation had an effect on job crafting through what's called individual personal growth initiatives. So let's take a second. And we'll talk about those just here in just a second. So, and they also examined how leadership feedback played a role in both their personal growth and initiative and error orientation. So let's break those down. And so when we talk about a culture of positive error orientation, we're saying that we're learning from our mistakes, right? Error isn't necessarily a bad thing. As long as our thought process is we fix it and we learn from it and we move on and do better. And so personal growth initiative is one's views on errors that allows them to view errors as either positive or negative. So the question is, how does this relate to job crafting? And in this study, the authors, they hypothesized that a positive error orientation would lead to greater job crafting, and that personal growth initiative would mediate these error orientations. So they sent out an online survey measuring the factors we discussed. And so what they discovered was precisely what they predicted, that high personal growth initiative was associated with a positive error orientation. And when this was the case, they were more likely to proactively initiate job crafting. And moreover, leadership feedback increased their levels of positive error orientation. So, in other words, when a culture is put in place that establishes and promotes a philosophy that there is positive in errors and that this is yet another opportunity for growth, employees feel this positive effect, and job crafting is indeed increased. So as we continue our discussion about promoting job crafting mindset and behaviors, we shift from the human resources side and we look at how companies as a whole can encourage and foster the specific behaviors that fit their organizational needs. So the first way that companies can do this, and we saw this a little bit about this earlier, is to encourage proactive behaviors, right? So this study involves more of a task job crafting aspect, in that the authors examined how contemplation on understanding work tasks, like the work context itself, and how one goes about them relates to psychological empowerment, and therefore proactive job crafting behaviors. So again, we're focusing on the task aspect of job crafting, right? And how individuals view the actions they are taking as having meaning. So the authors hypothesized that work-related reflection and psychological empowerment would increase the task job crafting behaviors, because psychologically empowered employees are more likely to engage in proactive behaviors, or what they refer to as active orientation. So again, through surveys consisting of about 300 employees from small to medium-sized companies, they measured the factors that we discussed, and their results inferred that when employees spend time reflecting on their work, they're more likely to establish a connection between their current work tasks with previous experience and increase their competency by understanding why they're doing what they're doing. So, and when their competency increases, they feel more psychologically empowered, and they're more likely to increase innovation and job crafting behaviors, and both, of course, being very much in line with goals of the orientation, because they're focusing on their specific work tasks, right? This is organizational goals that they're looking for, and those are the tasks that they're focusing on, increasing the competency in those tasks for that specific role for that organization. Now, the next way that a company can ensure that promotion and encouragement of job crafting behaviors gets permeated throughout a company, and we've kind of talked about this a little already, but it's the direct influence of a leader. Now, just earlier we talked about leadership in general as a means to establish culture, but this is the specific influence that a leader has on an individual employee or team member. So one study there, you can see in the middle, and this one actually one of my favorite articles I've read in some time. The authors examined the effects of the trickle-down job crafting behaviors. So in other words, they wanted to assess how a leader's job crafting behaviors influence their employees' job crafting behaviors. And the moderating effect was the empowering leadership had on this relationship. So the authors, they collected data from 7 high-tech companies, which again is probably why this study appealed to me. But they sent out surveys to the managers and their employees. And they asked the managers to fill out the surveys for themselves, but they asked the employees to fill out for both themselves and how they viewed their manager. And the results indicated that the higher a leader's job crafting behavior, the higher their employees' job crafting behavior were. However, and this was actually the interesting part because it went against the predictions, is that empowering leadership actually showed a negative association with job crafting. So, which the authors really didn't go into detail about. They just it was just kind of a couple of sentences like this. We don't really know why. We don't really have anything to imply about this. So they just kind of blew it off at the end there. But that kind of leaves me to wonder that, if other leadership styles would have the result that was expected, like transformational leadership or authentic leadership, servant leadership, adaptive leadership, or something like that. That kind of left me wondering a little bit. But the fact that being an example for the behaviors you wish to see and those who follow is very interesting for what it means, to be a leader in general when it comes to perceiving meaning and perceiving purpose. So, and while leaders being an example and working with employees is a terrific way to promote job crafting, obviously, they can't be everywhere at all times. So in order for companies to teach these behaviors and mindsets to a greater number of people quicker, they'll actually have job crafting interventions or job crafting trainings. And one study here that we see is it discussed the results of a training and intervention that they held that had some very promising results. And the authors held a job crafting intervention for teachers of students with special educational needs at 2 separate schools, and with one school acting as a control group with no intervention. And they took measurements over 2 different time periods and a final measurement 1 year after the intervention. So the intervention consisted of exercises and goal-setting practices aimed at job crafting behaviors, such as increasing challenging job demands, increasing structural job resources, and decreasing the hindering job demands, all the things that we spoke about earlier. And they used what they called proactive goal setting, which we're all pretty familiar with, I believe, at this time. And they would develop these goals themselves, and then they would have them defined and revised in a group setting. So there were 2 training sessions over 6 weeks, and then what they would do is practice by going through 6 steps of job analysis, personal analysis, and then the combined personal and job analysis, followed by creating meaningful personal change in their work situations, followed by reflection on the changes that they made, and then there was an individual assessment of the success of their activity. So at the end, the results showed that job crafting behaviors significantly increased for the intervention school, not only by their self-reported questionnaires, but also by their performance feedback from their supervisors. So they demonstrated higher levels of job crafting behaviors, and as a result, they demonstrated work engagement and higher performance as well. So, and this was the case not only in their 6 weeks of intervention, but it was the case even a year after they were measured again. So it's a simple example and definitely needs some expanding on, but it's an example of the lasting effects that even just 6 weeks of job crafting intervention can have. So, we can just imagine how impactful it would be for a company to make this a regular part of their organizational dynamic. So up to now, we've looked mainly at how organizations can promote job crafting and meaning mindset. in order to promulgate and invigorate these proactive behaviors in employees. So now we'll actually dive into a couple of examples where job crafting can actually be utilized to mitigate organizational stressors that a lot of employees deal with regularly. So the first study is primarily directed towards managers, but the principles and practices can really be used by any member of the organization, because these days a lot of employees, they end up playing they play a lot of different roles. They play multiple roles at any given time, whether they like it or not. And for example, it's like as a vice principal, you may have to play the role of administrator one day, the role of mentor the next day, the role of instructor or teacher the next day. So in a case like this, and with many other cases, vice principal is really just a title, because you might not know exactly which role you'll be playing from day to day. And this can oftentimes lead to what is referred to as role ambiguity, where you're uncertain what you're supposed to be doing, how you're supposed to be communicating, who you're supposed to be communicating with. And so, in other words, you're unsure about your roles and responsibilities at any given time. And this role uncertainty or role ambiguity can result in a fair amount of frustration, which can often lead to emotional exhaustion, burnout, and eventually intent to leave the company. So how can job crafting help in reducing these negative effects? Well, the authors of this study, they examine just that. How can job crafting help mitigate emotional exhaustion due to role ambiguity in order to reduce turnover? So after collecting survey data for managers from 600 stores, they found an indirect relationship between job crafting, role ambiguity, and emotional exhaustion and turnover intention. So in other words, when managers are using task job crafting behaviors, which of course we're talking about the task aspect here, is the emotional exhaustion and the role ambiguity and turnover intentions were lowered significantly. Now, another way that job crafting can help employees mitigate work stressors is based on a grander scale, so to speak. So with the manager study we just talked about, it was specific to the role, but in this present study down at the bottom there, we're talking about more on an organizational level. And it's a phenomenon a lot of people have dealt with, and not only have I dealt with it, but it's essentially the part of my job description. Because as a project manager, you're dealing with change constantly. In fact, that's the name of the game. As a project manager, it's your job to bring the change. You are the change at that point. So when we discuss organizational change, we're talking about a complete shift in a company structure. It could include processes, practices, personnel, or really anything that causes a noticeable difference in how an organization functions. So, and this, of course, can bring a lot of fear. It can bring a lot of anxiety, apprehension to a lot of employees. And, again, because of the uncertainty that change brings. And this has been shown to lower employee morale, lower motivation, job satisfaction, job security. And a lot of the times, employees don't necessarily get the support that they need in order to deal with this from the organizational standpoint or from their managers or supervisors. So the authors of this current study, they examined how employees' job crafting behaviors could impact adaptive performance. So how well they were able to adapt during times of change, and regardless of the influence of their managers. So because as we all know, not all managers are necessarily good leaders. So what they did was they had 29 hotel employees whose company was going through a major change. They had them complete a survey, first they had them fill out the survey evaluating their managers' overall influence, and then they had them fill out a diary every day for about a week with a questionnaire assessing their daily job crafting behaviors of the ones we've already discussed, seeking resources. Seeking resources such as other employees and coworkers, seeking challenging demands, and reducing the hindering demands. So At the end of the week, the researchers collected the data, and what they discovered was the daily job crafting behaviors resulted in higher adaptive performance when manager influence was lower. So the only crafting behavior that showed a significant relationship was resource-seeking behavior, such as asking others for help or asking others for feedback. So they didn't seek more challenges, and they didn't try to reduce any hindering challenges. They simply sought the necessary resources, mainly in the forms of the coworkers. So here, we're not looking at task or cognitive job crafting, but we're looking at relational job crafting, right? Or the who aspect of crafting. So when a manager wasn't necessarily available or influential during times of change and uncertainty, they sought guidance and direction and collaboration from others. So how do we piece this all together, and what does it all mean? As we've seen throughout the previous studies, is that there's a central theme of finding meaning in work, and we've looked at what the what with task crafting. We've looked at who with the relational crafting, and we've looked at the why with cognitive crafting in order to increase proactive job crafting behaviors in order to mitigate negative effect while enhancing positive effect in different regards. So in the final two studies we look at here, we're going to start with the study that looks at all three. And we're going to see if one type of crafting works better for some than others. And then we'll transition over into the research article that really dives into the why aspect, or the cognitive aspect of job crafting. So like I said, this current study, it takes into account all three types of job crafting. And the authors examined if a particular type of crafting is more preferred or is considered more important to some than others. And what they were assessing was the role of person-job fit and how age is a factor in the type of crafting that enhances their levels of job satisfaction. So what they did was they had employed participants from various industries complete an online survey at three separate waves. And the first wave measured the three different job crafting factors. And 1 month later, the same participants completed a second wave, which consisted of person-job fit variables. And a month after that, the third wave measured job satisfaction. And an example of a job crafting item on the survey would be, make friends with people at work who have similar skills or interests, or remind yourself about the significance remind yourself about the significance your work has for the success of the organization. And a job satisfaction item would be that all in all, I'm satisfied with my job. So pretty simple there. And what the results showed is that while person-job fit mediated the effects of job crafting on satisfaction for all three types of crafting, they found that for younger employees, task and relational crafting was significantly higher than cognitive, while cognitive crafting was significantly higher for older workers. So relationships were more important for younger workers, while finding meaning in the work they do was more important for older workers. So the authors inferred that younger workers, they're more concerned with developing their craft and creating relationships. They're not necessarily thinking about the meaning of anything right now. But the more experienced workers, they're more concerned about the dimensions of the job and reshaping the work to create meaningfulness and a work identity. So in that spirit, we transition to a very interesting study, especially when it comes to the practical applications. And down at the bottom there, and it deals directly with the cognitive job crafting and the motivational characteristics, specifically intrinsic motivation. So we're looking at how it impacts proactive cognitive changes and how these changes bring about meaning and well-being. So we've talked about what all this is. So we're just going to basically discuss real quick the methods and results and delve into the recommended practical application. So Again, the authors, they administered an online questionnaire to business management postgraduate students who were working white-collar jobs at the time, and the questionnaire measured cognitive job crafting, effective well-being, and intrinsic motivation such as self-determination and meaning. And then what the results demonstrated is that those high in cognitive job crafting had higher levels of positive of affection and lower negative affection. So in other words, cognitive crafting was a result of higher levels of meaning, purpose, and work identity. And it was associated with those high in intrinsic motivation. They were motivated to cognitively shape the meaning of their jobs, and self-determination compelled them to proactively seek job crafting behaviors. So, in other words, in this case, meaning and purpose combined with self-determination and intrinsic motivation led to cognitive job crafting and enhanced well-being. So, what does this mean for practical application? Well, the authors discussed exactly what we discussed previously, is that companies need to pay more attention to cognitive crafting, just as as they do with task and relational crafting, because as the studies have shown, it's more than just a singular concept. Cognitive job crafting, it's more than just that. It coincides with intrinsic motivation, self-determination. Both traits that are very important for effective, proactive employees. And also, they stress that the traditional top-down job design, as we're all pretty used to, can be combined with the bottom-up job design that we're discussing now, and to create a more meaningful and optimal job structure that benefits the individual and the company. And the companies that are concerned with employees' well-being, cognitive crafting has shown to foster the meaningfulness and purpose found in well-adjusted workers. So we've spent a good amount of time going over what the recent science says about the benefits of job crafting and how it can rejuvenate and invigorate satisfaction and well-being, as well as plenty of the positive affections. And so now we're going to look at one more because in this study, we're going to see how the science corresponds with the truths that God's Word teaches us about these phenomena. And then we'll transition into how meaning and purpose has already been given to us if we set our eyes on and our minds towards Christ. So real quick, this recent study takes on more of a spiritual view in the sense that it incorporates having a sense of calling and the role of spiritual leadership that can relate to job crafting and work meaningfulness. So again, the study consists of online surveys. It came in 3 waves, measuring job crafting, work meaningfulness, spiritual leadership, and sense of calling. And what they discovered, similar to what we've previously discussed, is that intrinsic motivation led to more job crafting. And in this case, when sense of calling was high, spiritual leadership moderated this relationship between job crafting and work meaningfulness, such that spiritual leadership and a sense of calling were motivated by care and hope and faith and love. And these traits are what facilitated workers to strive for better outcomes. So in other words, those with a higher sense of calling were more proactive in increasing their job crafting behavior. So why is this important, and how does this relate to God's Word? Well, if we look at Isaiah 40, 30, and 31, verse 30 states that even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. And that's what we've been discussing, right? There's times when we're just too tired. We're emotionally exhausted. We have no motivation, no satisfaction, no well-being, no meaning, no purpose. But the good news is that verse 31 promises us, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. So let's take a quick look at the word hope. And the definition of hope is a feeling of expectation and desire for the certain thing to happen. And again, that's exactly what we've been talking about. We find our meaning with the hope that something wonderful comes out of it in the end. It's our intrinsic motivation. In this case, God is our hope. God is our intrinsic motivation. And because we have hope, we already have been given a meaning. We've already been given a purpose through Him. So shifting back over to those who are still searching for meaning and who are lacking it, the same can be said for this theoretical framework of job crafting in general. There's a lot to be left to be desired for the model. Like I said, it's a new model, it's a new construct, it's very much in development, but it's gaining more traction. So there are plenty of gaps in leadership, role ambiguity, complexity, overload, and so on. So the short answer to that is yes, we definitely need more scholars focusing on practical and intervention and the intervention side to crafting. So, and how can companies, better establish and promote a culture and climate that leads to proactive behaviors? But the area I'm really interested in is the one we've kind of already discussed, which is organizational change. And like we've mentioned, organizational change, we have to talk about uncertainty, we have to talk about fear, apprehension, and resistance. But we also need to talk about some of the positive sides of intervention, right? So, of organizational change, and such as the fact that it can breed employee resiliency. And studies have shown that when proper leadership is in place and employees have a strong identification with the company, they become more resilient to uncertainty that comes along with change. So, how can job crafting make a difference in how resilient employees can be during times of organizational change? And what kind of experiment could we put together to measure such effects? So we'll take a look at that. We'll make this quick because I know I'm running short on time here, but the idea for a fairly simple intervention experiment would to examine how continuous job crafting training could impact high-tech workers who are going through a large organizational change, and how this continuous training can enhance meaningfulness that results in higher levels of employee resilience to change. So an idea for an experiment here would be, the study's purpose here is just due to the constantly changing world of IT. Purpose of the proposed study is to determine the impact of cognitive job crafting training on the resiliency of high-tech employees during times of organizational change. And a research question would be right along those lines of, does meaningfulness in work mediate the relationship between cognitive job crafting and employee resilience during times of change in high-tech workers? So really the methods here would be to preferably have between 150 to 200 high-tech employees. So organizations are about to engage in a large change. Divide evenly into 3 groups. We'd have a one-time training intervention group, a continuous training intervention group, and a control group. And the one-time intervention group would just have training before the change begins. The continuous intervention group would have training once a month for the duration of the change, and of course the control group would have no intervention. The measurements, I put both, but all 3 groups will take a monthly survey that's measuring the job crafting scale, meaningfulness, and employee resilience. And so hopefully this will help to broaden the knowledge regarding how consistent or continuous job crafting training during an actual change in the high-tech sector. So we have looked at why job crafting is becoming more researched and more popular, and the benefits that it promotes. We looked at the current state. We've looked at plenty of examples of human resources and practical examples. We looked at the biblical sense and where the science and the Bible coincide. And we talked about finding meaning. We talked about finding that purpose and the ways we can perceive not only the things we do and the people that we're around, but we can perceive the work in itself and the meaning and the quality that it gives us overall. So I want to thank you guys so much. I know I'm running quick on time here, but thank you guys so much. I'm looking forward to hear your feedback, and I hope everybody has a great day. And here are the references if anybody wants to take a look at those. There are quite a few here, so thank you guys.